starting that process up now. All right. And let us pray. Loving God, the story of our faith is a complicated one. It takes us in places that give both moments of hope and opportunity, but also places that aren't so comfortable. And yet, we need to study the whole history to know the paths of your faithful throughout history and to find those moments of grace where we can, but to also learn from the lessons that are less comfortable. And so in this study, give us a sense of openness, of learning about perhaps trying to come to understanding something either we might know a bit about or know nothing about. And that we might truly find you and listen with an open heart. So be with us tonight, we pray, in Christ's name. Amen. All right. So, welcome to the Crusades, which is not exactly a phrase that being in my particular role, that I'm actually all that comfortable saying. I mean, even the word crusade itself has become a challenge. That it is something that how we use it. Like sometimes it's been misused. In fact, it was used. Well, I mean, if you're familiar with Billy Graham actively used as part of his own branding, the Billy Graham Crusade. Except in its origins 1,000 years ago, actually, I suppose technically 900 years ago, just as a frame of reference, the Crusades are closer to us than the Crusades were to the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. In terms of in terms of distance in time. So, and we're going to go with that. So, this is an overall outline of where we're going, and as I always do, I do a review as to what we're doing when. We're doing this over 6 sessions, but over a course of 7 weeks, and you'll see, and that's largely because of Family Day. So, today is the background to Crusade. The whole thing. Why did they happen in the first place? What were the social, political, economic circumstances that led to them? Why did they happen? What was the and also asking the question of what the element of faith was, because they clearly were that was a significant part of them. But was faith the cause of the Crusades? Is a question that I will be asking as part of this. So that's today. Next, and then next week, we are whoops. Oh, I see. It does this fade out thing. And there we are. So next week we're doing just the first crusade. We're actually doing, and it's important that we deal with the first crusade in depth, and then the subsequent crusades become then more and more there is essentially extensions of the first. The first crusade is the most important one to kind of get our heads around in terms of what happened, when, and why it happened. And then the subsequent crusades were all in the aftermath of that. And I am going to be giving you sort of a verbal list of things to possibly watch, things that might be of interest to you, just to kind of give a bit of a background. And then so this week and next week, and then we're taking a week break because Family Day is on the 17th. And then we're doing on week 3, we're doing the First Crusade Part 2 on Monday the 24th. And then once we get into March, then we are doing the second and third Crusades. They actually, even though they're sort of it's just that they're a little bit more interconnected. So that's why we're doing two and three on the same night. We're taking two nights to do one, and then we're taking one night to do two. Um, but hopefully you'll see and understand why. And then we talk about the Fourth Crusade and beyond, because uh, because by the time that the Fourth and the Fifth Crusade, like the Fourth Crusade itself, uh, I mean, all of these were the were have their own unique their own unique character. The Fourth Crusade in particular gets pretty ugly. Not that the first three do well. I heard you laugh, Richard.
Sorry.
It's okay. Laugh away. As always, there is no such thing as a stupid question. There's never a bad time to ask it. So, and as long as you understand that there's an answer that, I could actually answer, I don't know. And then week 6 is we actually talk about the aftermath and the legacy of the Crusades. So we may touch on because there were a whole bunch of things that happened after these Crusades that happened more in Europe proper that gained the name Crusade. And so part of what we're seeing through here is the evolution of the term Crusade as well. And we'll get that. So anyway, we start with the just the overall background. And just very simply, what are the Crusades? Just a simple definition, and we're going to be doing that. Like as we go through this, we're working with historical definitions. There will be elements of faith in this as well, but the actual historical definition, as described here and in this particular context, is what we're dealing with are these military campaigns that happened in the Eastern Mediterranean involving forces from Western Europe specifically, that were sanctioned by the Latin Church with the goal of recovering the Holy Land from Islamic rule. That's the definition that we're working here. But specifically, well, like I'm talking here specifically because this was a Western European venture, and specifically the Latin-speaking church, or what now refer to as the Roman Catholic Church. But there was, of course, another church, the Eastern Orthodox traditions, in play as well. And for those of you who were part of the early Christianity, we ended about roughly 40 years before this time period that we're going into, although I'm going to step back into this a little bit, that we had this split between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. It was a little more complicated than that. We did that course. If you need a refresher, it's all on YouTube. You can go back and watch. So we can go do that. But the actual time period that we're dealing with here is the late 11th century to the 13th century. Although, as I mentioned before, a number of things, particularly after the 13th century, the various campaigns that were internal to Europe also began to acquire the name Crusade. But what we are focusing on primarily is the ones that are actually labeled by numerical order, like first, second, third, fourth, are the primary ones we're dealing with. And then in the aftermath and legacy, I'll be talking a little bit about those a bit more. Now, some historians, and I think there's a certain degree of accuracy to this, end the so-called Crusader era actually at the end of the 15th century in 1492, at the conclusion of the Spanish campaign to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula, aka Spain, from any sort of Islamic rule. But for the most part, any of the things that actually happened in the Middle East, that ended at the end of the 13th century. It did very decisively in 1291. So and notice the date 1492, which is the same year that, of course, Columbus eventually set out westward on his way to India, and then um, didn't and mistakenly thought he found it, which led to the colonial period. So really, what that is like you have this transition from the Crusade era to the colonial period, what would then be the colonial period, and they are linked. Um, they may not be linked in the way that you think they are, but they are definitely linked. So the first question is, what does crusade mean? And this is the English word for it. The Middle Latin term that was used for that was cruciate, and it has the root words of crux or crucio. And for those of you who do Harry Potter, Crucio was the name of one of the unforgivable curses. Namely, it was a torture curse. And curious enough, crux is short for cross. And don't forget, the cross was an implement of capital punishment in the original Roman context. So crux, and of course, crucio is torture, pain, and agony. So we're off to a great start. Okay, that doesn't exactly sound something pleasant. Well, it wasn't, but at the same time, that's how it was used in this. Is that the idea was that in the context in various parts of the gospel if anyone wants to be my follower, let them take up their cross and follow me. That's sort of the idea. This is the taking up of one's cross, and following Christ. I mean, ultimately that's it. But I find the irony of the literal definition probably quite striking given the context of what the Crusades were. But the idea is one is to take up the cross and follow Christ. And because Christ crucified, crucifixion, crucio, torture, pain, agony, it's all there. But in this more specifically, and we're going to get to we're going to stay what this is, and then we're going to come back to it a bit. So in 1095, the Pope Urban II responded to a call of help from the Byzantine Empire, who were appealing to the Western states for this. Basically, they were asking the Western states, the Western city-states, the Western feudal lords, and for aid. They were asking for military help. But because the Western state was so decentralized, there was no effective way of actually making individual communication. What is the best way to get a hold of them? Well, the Pope, the Pope in Rome had really was the one who had the communication contacts. So basically, the Byzantine emperor sent an envoy to Rome and said, you have a decent amount of sway with these people. Can you get them to send us some military aid? That's where this came from. And we'll get into the more details a little later tonight. But as a way to get them, the Pope, Urban II thought, hey, this is a good idea for various reasons. But how do I get people to actually care about going and helping the Byzantines? Because they wouldn't know them from Adam. they barely know anything over the next hill. Never mind, never mind the politics of the day. And so basically thought, well, okay, well, what is a way to do this? And I mean, I'll get into more detail, but he offered what were called indulgences for anyone who, quote, took up their cross to free Jerusalem from the invader, and he used the term cruciate, which of course is translated into English as crusade. That's where it came from, is take up your cross and go help. And he was as a motivational factor. Of course, infamously, you may have heard of indulgences in the context of Martin Luther, perhaps from some church history about the start of the Reformation. Well, I mean, the Reformation doesn't even come for until almost immediately after the Crusader period. But it was an indulgence was a very complex system of penance within the early Latin Church, specifically the Latin Church that they had developed. That it was a case of if you did a task, somebody else would pray for your soul, kind of thing. And that's oversimplifying it. And to grossly oversimplify it, it's almost like a get out of hell free card. So we have basically the Urban II offers these indulgences for anybody who would go. And so by the time of the First Crusade, as I mentioned, the indulgence itself, if one took on an indulgence for accomplishing a certain task, like, because you could do things like pilgrimages and things, and people were doing pilgrimages to Jerusalem and back. That was already a thing. But for anybody who joined in this, if they got to Jerusalem, and it's like, okay, you're supposed to help the Byzantine emperor, and if you look at a map, Jerusalem is nowhere close to Constantinople. Okay, we'll get to that. But by the time we get to the First Crusade, in that time period, an indulgence was effectively a get out of hell free card in exchange for some act of piety or service. And so therefore, in this, at the time, highly superstitious time, if the Pope was offering a get out of hell free card, that was pretty good incentive to go. And eventually the indulgences would also get tied to money. The building of the St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, for example, was tied to the sale of indulgences, which Martin Luther didn't like. But generally at this point in time, indulgences weren't a cash payment to, but rather an act of service to, and then people would pray for you and you get your, effectively, here's your get out of hell free card. I am grossly oversimplifying that, but effectively that's how people understood it. Richard, am I so far from is that sounding about right? Okay. I always have to run a few things by Richard to make sure that I'm kind of still there. So one of the things to keep in mind is that prior to 1095, Christians did engage in warfare, but it was never seen as a holy act. So for that Christians did fight in wars prior to 1095, but it was not seen as an act of faith at all. And some of that here is we have just putting this out. For example, Saint Augustine talks about it in develop the concept of the just war, that in certain circumstances, cities did have a right to defend themselves, but it didn't absolve one's responsibility in the context of war. If you kill somebody in the context of war, you have to, in some respects, account to that to God. Go ahead and fight, but the actions that you take in that, you are accountable to.
Is 744.
Yeah.
per
And
ball.
and 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 so we had this
744 per ball. So you have.
Hey, Joy,
Hi.
can you mute?
Oh,
Because we,
sure.
yeah.
we can hear you counting.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
No worries. I can mute you, Joy. So anyway, one of the things there was there's this kind of paradox that indulgences themselves were offered in exchange for acts of piety rather than money, as they would later be. And so anybody who joined the crusade, hey, you get an indulgence, and therefore taking up the crusade, this military campaign suddenly became an act of piety, which was a fundamental shift. Certainly away from St. Augustine in terms of the concept of the just war, that if there is an injustice, you may participate, but you are still accountable for it. Whereas this is now seen as an act of piety, and therefore, the without really thinking it through, the accountability for what would happen under that would also be uh, 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 an issue. So this comes up a little more quickly that people will point to religion as the cause of wars, and they will point to the Crusades. But you do have to ask the question: were the Crusades a series of holy wars? And the short answer is, well, yes and no, but mostly no. Because of course the official sanction from the Western Latin Church, offering a divine favor, effectively a get out of hell free card to anybody who participated in these campaigns, gave it an air of like official, that God, that this is something that God wants. But the actual underlying circumstances leading up to the Crusades themselves were not. Um, and it's that complex series. It's much more earthy. We're dealing with issues of territory, economics, supply, and for those of you who may not um, the who may not be aware. My first degree is actually military history, and one of the people that we would study was one of Napoleon's generals, I believe, um, who was actually was German, and the last name was Clausewitz. Um, and he offered many different treatises on wars, but also in several other writers, is that warfare is, quote, diplomacy by other means. And so warfare is a not necessarily a breakdown of diplomacy. It is a form of diplomacy. I mean, you may have heard the phrase that but it's violent diplomacy, and it's often and it's very costly. But unfortunately, if politicians or leaders think that it's an easy win, then we're in trouble. Um, so we have that. But the religious element of the Crusades, which is we are going to be dealing with this, was motivating people to go, not the cause of it, but saying we need to get people to move here. And how do we get them to do that? Well, we motivate them through, and at the time, the population was quite religious and very superstitious, probably more superstitious than they were religious. Although, because they had just come through a period where there were definitely there was a spiritual movement called the Cluniac reforms that had been in place, that were trying to dismantle the corrupt systems that had been in the Western Church. Not that they were that successful, but on a local level they were. Um, and one thing to keep in mind is that Christians living under the Islamic rule lived like if it was purely a religious war, then why didn't the Crusades start when Islam first arose, the roughly 300-400 years before this happened? Because if it was religious, it would have been, hypothetically, it would have been immediate. And so what we need to do is, what circumstances changed in the 300 years between the rise of Islam and effectively the beginning of the Crusades, that 300-year period? What was happening there? So we're gonna get to that. So let's talk politics of 1095. And if your eyes glaze over, I hope, I really hope that you tell me and say, John, this is just not working, or if you have a question related to it. So this is basically what the borders looked like, roughly at the time of the first crusade. There's this leans a little further to this. I'll be dealing with some of this, but this is roughly what the territorial boundaries and borders look like. Is that you have the Holy Roman Empire here, you have the Kingdom of France. Can everybody see my mouse moving around?
Mm-hmm.
So you have the Holy Roman Empire here, you have the Kingdom of France here, but all through here you have various different Islamic states. It wasn't all one, and we'll get to that in a little bit. You have the so-called Eastern Roman Empire, but this is the Byzantine Empire, and then you have the Empire of the Seljuk Turks in this area here. And the Seljuks actually controlled a fair bit, but all of Asia Minor at the time. And then we have the southern element of the Italian peninsula. We have Corsica and Sardinia here in the Mediterranean Sea. So anyway, we'll get to this in a little bit more. So this is approximately again what it kind of looked like. And probably this map is a little easier to read. So broadly speaking, we have areas that are France. We have England and Normandy, which are all under one political control, because of course the last successful invasion of the British Isles was in 1066, about 30 years, not quite 30 years before this, where we have the Norman invasions in Normandy. Curiously enough, we're going to also talk about this. The Normans also decided to take up residence in southern Italy too. The Normans are weird but important in this, and we'll get to that. So we also have the different states, like we have these different Spanish states all through here, and then you have the different Islamic states through here. We have the Seljuk Turks, you have the Armenian states, you have various Bedouin tribes there, the Caliphate, all of this. So this is approximately what it looked like. So as we mentioned in the last course that we did, there was a major split between the Eastern and Western churches, split between the Greek-speaking Eastern Church and the Latin-speaking Western Church, and that happened in 1054. Again, if you really want to know the lead up to that, we have the videos from the previous one. Suffice to say that basically the two churches effectively excommunicated each other. It was called the Great Schism. And even though in the West we talk about the Protestant Reformation and the Roman Catholic Church, the major split, even though some other Christian churches more centered in and around Egypt, which still exists, the Coptics, had kind of fallen away on their own, but this major split had only happened about 29 years before this. And so so we were still dealing with this. As I mentioned, we have this was the end of the Viking Age, where the you have William of Normandy, or William the Conqueror, as he was had the label, invading England and basically setting up what would eventually become what we now know as the United Kingdom. Um, but at this point in time, the Scandinavian populations that had been part of these Viking raids and movements and things like that had become almost fully integrated within the context of Europe. Um, so, whoops. There we go. As I mentioned before, because the main thesis from the last course is that in the split between East and West, is that the Roman Empire never actually fell in the East. What is called the Byzantine Emperor, they wouldn't call themselves, or the Byzantine Empire, they didn't call themselves the Byzantine Empire. They called themselves the Roman Empire. And their capital was Constantinople, which was formerly known as Byzantine. And they understood themselves to be the direct continuation of the Roman Empire, that evolved out of the Roman Republic, back in the first century BCE, and the Roman Republic before that. But what happened is that the Western Roman Empire fell. The Eastern Roman Empire stayed in place, but the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the various Gothic invasions, about 200 odd years before, the about from the 5th century on, and in various states the Byzantines kind of got power back, but for the most part any sort of centralized political power in the West had collapsed, and the Roman Church, the Latin speaking church, effectively stepped into that gap as basically the centralized authority in the West, even though they really officially never held any direct power themselves. They established basically, nothing politically happened without approval from Rome. Specifically, the big thing in there happened around 800, the crowning of Charlemagne for the Holy Roman Empire. Is that no state or no kingdom or empire or whatever in the West could officially claim authority without them being actually crowned either approved by or directly by the Pope in Rome. And that power was enormous. And so, the papacy at this point had come through a period of deep corruption. And thanks to as I mentioned, the Cluniac reforms, they were in process of reforming. They never fully escaped that level, the real, that level of corruption that they had, but they were emerging from it. And as a result, at least among the general population, is that interest in religious expression became more and more prominent. There was a time where it was almost entirely secular at least in the West, because the Roman Church was simply seen as just more politics as usual. There was still a lot of politics going on, but of course, as I mentioned, in the East, that the Byzantine Empire was effectively the remaining elements that claimed tradition and heritage under as the Roman Empire, that was at its absolute peak about 500 years before. But they had continued to to exist and linger. I mean, the Justinian Empire basically enveloped almost everything around the Mediterranean. Briefly, but it was that largest extent happened, but they never ever regained that. Uh, and So you have this overall waning of power, and you have these conflicts and external threats, specifically from the east. First, it would be the Sassanid Empire, which was a Zoroaster that was a Persian, um, was a Persian political entity, and then eventually, of course, the rise of the Islamic states, and there in about 1095, the emperor of the Byzantine emperor, uh, there was a new threat that he was trying to deal with, and the new threat was only in this area here, just on the edge of the Byzantine emperor and the Seljuk states, and the emperor Alexios Komnenos the first appealed to the West for military help. So that's where that came from. Any questions so far?
Nope.
Okay. All right. So what we need to do is back up and let's talk about the rise of Islam. And with the development and the rise of Islam, we have of course. It was a new religious movement, radically monotheistic in terms of, as opposed to the polytheistic that had previously existed amongst the various Arab tribes in the Arab Peninsula. And it was centered around the writing and teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. So approximately in 623, this kind of emerges. I've said radically theistic, which was common with Judaism and Christianity. So there was a common point. They differed on the person and work of Jesus, of course. But Islam in Arabic means submission to God. It should also be noted that Arabic and Hebrew are actually very closely related languages. They are both what are called Semitic languages. And so Arabic, Aramaic, and Hebrew are all related. And they have a lot of common words. In fact, if you speak Hebrew, you could probably understand a certain degree of Arabic, and vice versa. So Islam, submission to God. So therefore, a Muslim is one who submits to God. And what happened was that Muhammad's movement of unifying the Arab tribes under this banner. Muhammad stepped into a political vacuum. There was no other there was a lot of different scattered things politically, but Muhammad happened to arrive at the right time, and in that unified the Arab tribes and stepped northward into what was a real political vacuum. There wasn't anything there that they were competing with. It was just at that point it was almost lawless, and they just moved in because what had been happening is the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire, had been fighting with each other for so long, they were burnt out and spent. And so when the Arab tribes began to move north, there was nothing to stop them. And so as a result, there was this enormous and very quick spread of Islam, and that they took advantage of this weakness. They extended control over the territories of both the Sassanid Empire and the Byzantine. Just came through. The Sassanid Empire pretty much almost collapsed entirely, and the Byzantines were pushed back. And they established what were called caliphates. And I mean, caliphate is just, it's a political governing unit. Like you might call something an empire or a kingdom. They just use the term caliphate. And so, but specifically, the phrase caliph is someone who was considered to be a steward of the prophet. In other words, continuing the tradition of Muhammad's legacy. Of course, there would be all kinds of different titles that you would probably see there. You think things like Sultan and things like that that have very much, we would think of very Middle Eastern kind of flavor, but effectively they were all stewards of the legacy of um, the prophet. So what you see here, this particular map shows the extent and how it expanded. At least initially, under Muhammad itself, it united the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula, what we now call most of Saudi Arabia, but there's also Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Dubai is there, Yemen, and others, but basically united the entire Arab Peninsula. And then and that was, as you can see, that happened over a period of one decade. Just and that came after Muhammad's death. The various the caliphate initially expanded to this area, and as you can see, they basically almost entirely took the territory of the Sassanid Empire, which was here, and then spread eastward. But there was nothing to stop them. That's just it. There were nothing else that was political, and they had a means of politics and a means of economics that people liked. They welcomed them. And then, of course, over the next really 100 years, you have this expansion here. So over a period of about 130 years, you have this rapid, relatively speaking, this rapid expansion of Islam, and in terms of the political control. Now, they weren't necessarily completely unified, but at least initially they were, and there was this very rapid kind of expansion. And so what we had here is this initial expansion, and then they as just going back to this diagram, is you notice that they only got about this far. That even though the Byzantine Empire, like the Sassanids, had largely occupied this space, but the Byzantines more or less stopped them in on the eastern edge of what is called Asia Minor, what we now call modern-day Turkey. And so, there was a siege. They did actually, military forces did get as far as Constantinople, but they were not successful in taking Constantinople. And so, the Umayyad Caliphate, one of the successor caliphates, managed to successfully move across further east, but the Byzantine Empire managed to hold the line. And again, this was a political expansion. Yes, there was religious motivation behind it, but effectively those aligned with under the banner of the unity of under one God, but also like the large expansion of just the Arab expansion. It's sort of akin to the Scandinavians and the Viking raids, that kind of thing, or the movement of various populations from Asia, eastward. This was very much a part of human migration, and yes, there was a religious element to it, but it was mostly economics. because they offered a system of networks of securing trade routes, resources, making sure that people were well fed, they had roof overhead. That was the primary thing. It was trying to make sure that people had resources in the areas that needed them. And if these forces that were coming in were offering that, which they did, they were very much welcomed. The other thing to keep in mind is that as much as we talk about Islam, Islam is about as monolithic as the phrase Christianity. In other words, it's not. Um, and so do keep in mind that the caliphates themselves, they were not monolithic. They weren't fully united. We talk about this, but they weren't. There was internal politics going on with that. They often fought with themselves, the competing factions in terms of who was ruling. So, that who would be in charge. And I mean, one of the earliest examples of this is this split between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam, which we kind of sort of use the description of Roman Catholic versus Protestant, but that's not really quite right, or even the Eastern Church and the Western Church, because this happened the split between Sunni and Shia happened very soon after the death of Muhammad. It's how do we best preserve that legacy, and so there is the differentiation between Sunni and Shia, which are the two major parts of Islam, but they aren't the only ones. And so we have, of course, rough at the period of maximum extension, the Umayyad Caliphate was then overthrown by disaffected groups, and they formed what is now called what was called the Abbasid Caliphates. But there were several of them, so it wasn't just like one big monolithic empire. There was a whole bunch of smaller states with this, and the Abbasids moved the overall general capital to Baghdad. And their focus actually was more east towards what is now Pakistan and India. But how they used political control, it was very, very diffuse. There were a lot of more local things. So it was more akin. The best way, I put it right here on the screen, that it was different dynasties. In a broader, it was almost more akin to a commonwealth, really, in how we use that phrase today. But I mean, the reality is that it was a bunch of fragmented states, of which we're not even clear as to where some of those borders were. And there was a lot of ebb and flow throughout the history that, we're even still trying to kind of figure out as to who controlled what when. And so drawing lines on maps was actually much more difficult. And so until about, the mid to late 9th century, most of the leaders of the caliphates were it was a largely ethnically Arab movement, but of course they were governing people, and it was very, 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 very diverse. And so among the various tribes, the peoples that they were governing in this area were, of course, right here, Arab, Persians, Berbers, Slavs, and Turks. But it was also Islam. Under Islam, it was also religiously quite diverse. So because the Slavs, the Turks, the Berbers themselves were not Muslim, at least initially. Eventually, they did. Many of these tribes did adopt Islam, but it was not. It wasn't enforced, put it that way, at least at the time. But also, you had Jewish, Zoroastrian, and Christian populations living in peace under Islamic rule. Specifically, Jewish and Christians actually because there were ties to this, that the recognition of Moses as a prophet, as Jesus as a prophet. gave them special status, protected status, in the context of in the context of Islam. But after 860, that stopped. That ceased to happen. That the overall rulers were no longer Arab. And eventually, there's this shift, and of course, the caliphate itself became increasingly decentralized, depending on more on local political control. Sometimes we would use the phrase warlords, but that wasn't really quite right. And so, whoever was in charge in Baghdad was seen more as a symbolic figurehead, and we just kind of do our own thing. Um, and so what eventually happened is that under Persians and Turkish, so one of the reasons why, like for example, modern day Iran, ethnically they are Persian, they are not Arab. The modern day Turkey are not they are not ethnically Arab. They are largely, no, but not entirely, Turks. And so you have the control specifically from about 932 that the in these the control largely, for example, fell under Persian. They were still Islamic, but largely Persian control in this part. And then following that, then you had approximately in this rise. Notice there's an overlap in dates here, where you have the Buyids and you have the Seljuks, and the Seljuks were Turks, and they are a very important part of this story, and I want to get to that. Is because, and so here's how largely the what this eventually had. You had the Buyids largely in the Caliphate, the Buyid Emirate, the Samanid Emirate, Azerbaijan, the Kingdom of Armenia, the Emirate of Mosul, and the Fatimid Caliphate, and then of course you have Yemen, Oman itself, Nubia, Ethiopia. All of these largely were under the broad banner of Islam, but they were their own nation states. And then you have, notice the Byzantine Empire at this point in time is basically Greece and what is now modern day Turkey, but Asia Minor, roughly under this. But these were different groups. But specifically the Seljuks, which are the Turkish Empire, is because in the lead up to the Crusades, the Seljuk Empire was the main political entity on the eastern on the eastern edge of the empire of the Byzantine Empire. They were the primarily point of contact, the people they were in contact with directly, and also both in conflict and in trade. And ethnically, they were largely Turks, Oghuz Turks. And they had migrated from around the Caspian Sea into northern Persia and into Asia Minor, the Seljuk Turks at this point. So again, population migrations moving around, and and as it says here, even though they were ethnically from a different region, they had largely adopted both Islam religiously, the culture, the Persian culture. But they also began to gain more and more political control, and this is important because the Seljuk Turks, the Seljuk Empire, so not large, by this time the Seljuk Empire of its own, like not necessarily tied to anything else, eventually invaded the Byzantine Empire in around 1068. So about 14 years after the great East-West split, you have the Turks starting to move, physically move into new territories. And their whole point was to gain what they were trying to do was to secure their position against the Fatimid Empire that controlled Egypt, North Africa, and the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. So they were doing this. They were moving against the Byzantines, not because they were moving against the Byzantines, but because they needed territory, space, and control in order to establish their own political control against another Islamic empire. You know, like there was no religion paid a very secondary issue to this, because they were securing this because their primary opponents were also were also Muslim, but over there. And so really what was happening here was it was a strategic move, and the idea is they wanted to move forward, stabilize the border against the Byzantine Empire, and then move directly on the Fatimids. So that's what they wanted to do. And so, eventually what happened was they, the various incursions and invasions that didn't, I thought, oh, well, this is going to cost too much. So they eventually came to a peaceful settlement in about 1069 with the Byzantines, just to secure that and to say, okay, we don't have to worry about that. Now we can focus on the Fatimids. That's what we want to do. And because that was the focus. They were focused south, not west. However, if you have heard the phrase Byzantine plot, sometimes it's used by authors to describe something that is very, very convoluted and double dealing and all that kind of fun stuff. Well, the reason is because the Byzantine Empire was very good at this kind of politicking, and that's why it was named after them. So you have the Eastern Empire sort of in Asia Minor proper, between the Byzantine Empire and the Seljuk Empire, in constant flux. But of course, emperors had their own territorial ambitions, and one of the Byzantine empires was this constant lamenting of the loss of what they had under Justinian. And eventually, like, some of them had delusions of grandeur, of reclaiming it all back, of making Rome great again, kind of thing. And were interested in trying to reclaim those territories. And so the idea was, let's extend this peace treaty with the leader of the Seljuk Turks, but secretly they were moving their own forces to reclaim fortresses in Anatolia, Asia Minor, and other parts of Turkey. In other words, they said, "Here's peace," while they were actually moving military forces out of sort of behind the curtain over there. The trouble is of course, when you double deal, when you found out that you have been double dealt, your reaction is not exactly positive. And so basically they said, okay, all right, we'll deal with the Fatimids later. We need to go deal with this. We need to put them in their place. And that's pretty much what happened is that there were the Byzantines had some successes and decided at Manzikert, you know what, I'm going to lead this myself. Back in the day when the rulers themselves actually took to the field of battle themselves. And he himself led this battle against the Seljuk Turks directly at Manzikert. And just so you know where this was a place, Manzikert is way over here. Constantinople is here, Asia Minor, and the capital at the time that at least for the Seljuk Empire was in Aleppo, which is now in modern day Syria. And basically, they ended up meeting on the field of battle at Manzikert. So what we have here is we have this, Romano is actually, he's like he has professional troops, um, and and somewhere in the neighborhood of between 40 and 70,000. We don't know exactly how much, but that's approximate. But 10,000 of those were Byzantine troops, and then you have these different other groups, including, interestingly enough, Frankish and Norman mercenaries from Western Europe. They were already there. And then you have some Turks themselves who are mercenaries. And we have mercenaries from the Georgia, not far from the Caspian Sea, Armenia, and from Antioch, which is actually not too far from Aleppo. This is this is the Byzantine Empire. On the other side, and then the ones who were in charge, we have the the emperor himself. You have you have the Duke of Antioch, and a few others, and including a Frenchman by the Rousseau de Bayeux. I don't forgive my French pronunciations. So this is on one side. Now, don't write this down. This is just so you know the kind of things that they were dealing with here. On the other side, the Seljuk Turks were actually outnumbered almost 2-1. And they were stationed out of Aleppo, Mosul, and primarily this was Arslan, the Sultan of the Seljuk Empire. And the battle took place August 26, 1071. And unfortunately, even though he had the numerical upper hand with the forces, things fell apart because there was an intelligence and loyalty failure. In other words, they didn't know where the Turks were or where they were coming in. And not only that, considering that several of the people that several of the military groups that were under their command, they were themselves they were mercenaries, and if of course mercenaries paid fight for the highest bidder, and so their loyalty can switch at the drop of a hat. And not only that, like in this, let's divide the force in half, cut off enemy reinforcements and take to the field here. So I'm going to go to Manzikert, you cut off the reinforcements. But of course, many of the mercenary units that were Turks defected to the Seljuk. No, we're going to fight for you. So all of a sudden, and then not only that, you had you had Andronicus Ducas, who was leading the rear guard. He was also Byzantine. The de Bayeux is, of course, a Frankish noble with his own forces. Decides not to commit his forces to the battle, and so that 40 to 70,000 just evaporated, and so and leading the rear guard, Ducas fled, and not only that, not only did he flee, he fled, got to Constantinople. Fourth, and without knowing it, declared that Romanos IV had been killed in order as a plot to gain the throne for himself. And it was a complete disaster for the Byzantines. So Romanos IV was captured, brought before Arbaslan, who treated him actually quite well, all things considered. And the Byzantine emperor agreed to concessions, in exchange for effectively returning home. And so he ceded the cities of Antioch, Hierapolis, Edessa, and Manzikert. So a lot of in the eastern areas of Asia Minor. There was also lots of gold and what was called a tribute. In other words, they had to pay a certain amount to them as a tribute for letting him go, and if in other words, to kind of keep them at bay. Oh yeah, and there's a marriage involved, and then even though largely Asia Minor itself was left untouched, they no longer had the military ability to defend the region, and there will be more on this later. And so Romanus was sent home with gifts and a guard. They escorted him home. They actually treated him quite well. However, he did reclaim his throne from Ducas's treachery. But then Romanus the Fourth was overthrown. They blinded him for his failure. They exiled him, and then he eventually died in obscurity. Not a very pleasant way to go. So what happened is that Bayeux would still play a role. He was kind of kept on the payroll of the Byzantines. Went into Asia Minor with a number of like Western heavy cavalry to try to shore up those defenses. But he ended up capturing the city of Ankara, which is now the modern day the capital of modern day Turkey, and of course set up his own independent state of Galatia. Mercenaries are a fickle bunch. When they and so kind of annoyed at this, the new emperor made a deal. Again, plots. Made a deal with the new Seljuk Sultan to remove this upstart, and said, you know what? If you remove him, you can have those lands. And so the Seljuk Turks said, okay, and they basically invaded it. And more and more of Asia Minor fell to the Seljuk Turks. And eventually, Asia Minor itself, almost in its entirety, became what was called the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. And Rum was the Islamic or the Arabic word for, or the Turkish word for Rome, because we got that from the Romans, or the Roman Empire, the people who called themselves the Roman Empire. So here's how it looked after all of that. So in the about 15 years before the start of the Crusades, you can see how much territory the Byzantine Emperor had just straight up lost. I mean, the Byzantine Empire still had some territories in the Crimean Peninsula, the northern part of this. They also did have Cyprus and some territories here, but Nicaea was firmly within the Seljuk Sultanate, and was there. You had again the king, and then this territorial loss. Remember the map I was showing you before that showed the border like here, and now it had just almost completely moved, almost the entirety there. And so the Byzantine Empire is weak. They're no longer able to any sort of realistic control of Asia Minor. The eastern borders were now fully destabilized, and other groups and leaders are trying to establish footholds, and they are just constantly trying to fend all these different groups off. And so they're fighting the Pechenegs, the Chakas, and the Normans, in addition to the Seljuks. And so the Byzantine Empire was also destabilized, and ruling one family over another. So that just fragmented politics, very, very, very weakened. Now, I wanted to do a sidebar. Well, Normans, aren't they the ones who invaded England? What are they doing all the way over here? And what you kind of need to know is that in the early part of 1000, the Byzantine Empire actually held territory in southern Italy, right in here. But the reality was that the Normans themselves were effective mercenaries, and they were often hired to come in and do this. And while they successfully invaded England in 1066, in the period between roughly just at the very end of the 10th century, right in through about halfway through the 12th century, Norman mercenaries themselves became embroiled in the politics of southern Italy, eventually, and quite often that put them in conflict directly with the Byzantine Empire. And they would eventually wrest control of this entire southern part away from the other ones. And the governance of southern Italy were actually Normans. You've heard the phrase lingua franca, in other words, the modern trading language of the day. At this point in time, French, at the version of French that existed at this time, was becoming the primary one, and largely then, thanks, that was due to the to the Normans, because they spoke French. And Normans themselves, they were very warlike, and so and we'll get to this. So what we had here is you have a weakened empire that desires to get it all back, make Rome great again, and it gathered traction under Alexios I Komnenos, the emperor at the time. And he was wanting to try and reclaim territories lost to various places, but he needed to strengthen his own his military. And so as early as as early as about 5 years before the crusade itself was declared, wanted to repair the relationships with the papacy, wanting help, and trying to get there. By the way, you don't see it, but there is a child leaning on my shoulder here. So anyway, say hi everybody, and then go back.
Hi.
Anyway, so in about 1090, so this movement is building, and about 5 years later, he makes this formal appeal after running over a couple of things, and makes an appeal specifically to Pope Urban II, again, because it was only contact point, because I don't know who's really in charge here, but the Pope seems to have connections with this. So, you know what? Appeal to him. Can you help me procure mercenaries from the Western kingdoms in order to help his cause of reclaiming parts of the Roman Empire in the East? In other words, reclaim Asia Minor. That's what he wanted. That's what he was looking for. But the response that he got was very unexpected. And that's where we get to here, and that's what happens next. So we're just in this part of leading up to it. Whoops, I didn't intend to stop that. Let me just I need to get this back to sharing this. There we go. So we now get so that's where we get to, is the primary thing of this is we now have this weakened empire asking for help from different from the Western forces, and all he wants, all this emperor wants, is I need to mobilize the military forces. We've got money. We're willing to pay for them, because the one thing that the Byzantine Empire did have is they had money. They were actually economically fairly well off, but they had lost a lot of their territories. And so that desire to reclaim is what they were wanting to reclaim.
Okay.
So and so in terms of wanting to repair those relationships with the West, hey, maybe there's a deal that can be made. Let's seek help. And specifically, they wanted mercenaries from the east. I'll get into this a little bit more next week, but it presented the Pope with an opportunity, and the reality was, in Western Europe, and I will cover this in more detail next week. Western Europe was in a constant state of warfare amongst nobles all the time. They constantly were fighting with each other. And Pope Urban thought, eventually, hey, maybe if we give them kind of a common cause, they'll stop fighting with each other, and we can actually have peace in Western Europe by just like sending them somewhere else. And I mean, I'll get to the detail of this. And I mean, part of what we're going to deal with next week as well is that I have sort of half joked about saying, if you want to understand the Crusades, watch Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I mean, the reality is Monty Python and the Holy Grail doesn't go anywhere close to Jerusalem. It doesn't even get out of England. But the insanity of it is very much like granted, it's savage satire, but sometimes that savage satire was expressing some of the reality that we're going to talk about next week. Particularly when it comes to something called the People's Crusade, which will be part of the first part of the discussion. And yeah, so that's one of the reasons why we're also dealing with the immediate lead up and the response to this request from the Byzantine Empire. So, you have this weakened state and wanting to expand from that. So anyway, that is all my slides tonight. Any questions at this point, or is it one of these situations where your brain is full?
No, because I was under the understanding that this was a religious war, and it's not.
Mm.
It's not Islam against the Roman Empire. This was all about people fighting over wanting land and property. So it was not religious in any way, shape, or form, is what I've gotten from you.
Yeah,
it wasn't religious in any way.
At least in terms of the motive. However,
they all got under the same banner of whether it was Muslim or the Christian crusade aspect.
Yes.
But it had nothing to do with actual religion.
Yeah. The actual start of it was entirely political, economic,
That's disgusting.
and territorial control. Where the religion part comes into it, and it does play into it, is motivation.
Well, that's what they used.
Yeah,
they used the religious aspect in order to motivate these two sides to fight.
Yes. So it's religion's responsibility in this is a motivational one, and it's also this constant warning. And I mean, I talked about this in the Revelation course about the dangers of when religion becomes subservient to politics. And that is part of what a significant part of what happens in the Crusades.
Okay, I will now shut up.
No. I think you raised a very good point, because that's one connection that I didn't necessarily make in these slides.
No, but as I've gone over this, I've gone, oh my God, this is a lot of information, and it was really interesting to find out about Islam. But other than that specific information, the rest of everybody fighting over wanting land and property and control and had nothing at all to do with religion.
Yeah. This was like, and yet, like, that motivating factor, which we will talk about. So it becomes kind of intertwined with it. But the primarily, the what's the phrase in the causus belli, the cause of war, was not religious. Was not a religious one, even though there was very strong religious overtones to it. And yes, when we get to it, in terms of how it started, there was a very strong religious element to it. But in terms of and so that's the part where we may bleed into that a little bit. But in terms of the actual circumstances that led up to the Crusades, it was just, the Byzantine emperor wanted wanted mercenary help that he could control. Because up until that point, the various mercenaries that they had. Now, when we get into this, it becomes just as complicated. And if anything, if past is prologue, the incident of Roland de Bayeux, basically creating his own kingdom in Anatolia, history repeats itself, shall we say? But we probably won't get to that part until week 3. Which is the second half of the First Crusade. But anyway, so next week is the First Crusade. But as part of that, there's actually 2 elements. There's the calling of Crusade, and then there's the lead up to Crusade, and then and in the midst of that, there's something called the People's Crusade, which will actually be a major part of next week. And just as a content warning, that one gets dark. Not that this whole thing isn't dark in some way, shape, or form, but that's where the Monty Python and the Holy Grail, particularly this skit about the witch. I don't know if you've ever seen it in particular, but there's also, I mean, the whole ethos of the film that we get into. So, and to a certain degree, there's amount of laughing. Now, the other thing is, the other media that I'm going to suggest is, I don't know, there was a film by Ridley Scott called Kingdom of Heaven, which actually dealt with the aftermath it tells the story of what happens in the lead up to, I believe, the Second Crusade. And stars, among others, like Ridley Scott is the director, Orlando Bloom, fresh off of his success with Lord of the Rings, Liam Neeson is in it, several other actors that you would know. Even Edward Norton is in there, but you can't tell because he's got a mask on. It didn't do well in the box office. I saw it. I thought it was very good. But I'm going to suggest that one's on your watch list, but don't watch it until after the First Crusade, because the circumstances you may not understand until after.
Right.
So look for it if you can find it, to watch Kingdom of Heaven at some point. I need to rewatch it myself, but you need to pretty much understand what happened during the First Crusade before watching that film. It's almost the intermediary between the First Crusade and the Second Crusade. So, okay. Any other questions? Because we're coming up to time, but I also have plenty of time for questions or anything else. So, if you would encourage you, if you do have any questions, please do ask them. And again, we're going to be I'll be recording. I'll be fully recording this. Or I am recording this, and I'll once this is processed, I'll upload it to YouTube and share it out every week. So Donna, I just saw your camera come back on. Any questions from you?
No, I think I'm good. I got a head full of stuff in here. Just kind of sorting it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what I kind of hope is, like, the trouble is we're dealing with elements of geography and political organizations that are so different from what we've got today. I mean, when we're looking at a certain map, we expect to see lines in a certain place. And they're not. And the reality is that, in fact, over even short periods of time, those lines moved all over the place. So it was very, very difficult to really nail down that. So I'm not expecting you to memorize that. The main thing, the takeaway from tonight is that ultimately the Seljuk Empire itself, was a perceived threat, not necessarily a direct threat, but certainly was the source of territorial losses to the Roman Empire, even though their primary focus was actually on another Islamic caliphate that was a rival. But the Byzantine Empire wanted those territories back, couldn't get them themselves, so they appealed to the West to say, hey, can you help us? And that's ultimately that's the main thing that I want you to take away from tonight. So any other questions?
Nope.
All right. Thank you. Next week, First Crusade Part 1. You don't want to miss this one. So
Okay.
anyway, and as always, record it. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
No worries. I'm just going to stop. I'm going to stop the recording now. Okay. And thank you.